Today you're going to learn a different method to solving those trinomials, in some cases the ones where we have to factor out. But this is a different method from the grouping method that some of you might find easier. Sometimes that grouping method is awesome, but sometimes you end up with some really big numbers when you multiply that A and that C term. Okay, so the first step for this method is the same as the first step for grouping. If you can factor anything out from all the terms, that is the very first thing you should do. Okay? And remember, if that leading coefficient is negative, you have to factor out that negative. That A term has to be positive. Okay? And then what we do is we make a box or something that looks like a table to help us factor. Okay? So this picture over here on the right. And then what we do is we list our A term in the top left box and our C term in the bottom right box. Now you remember that this A term has to be positive because it was negative. We already factored it out. Okay? Remember the signs for the rules. If the C term is negative, we need one of each. If C is positive but the middle term is negative, then they're both negative. And if everything's positive, then all of our factors are positive. Okay? These other two squares are what we need to figure out. Okay? This is our guessing and checking part for this method. Okay? So what these two squares do, though, is have to add up to your B term. So let's look at one. And I'm actually going to change the first problem in your notes to be number 43 from your homework. Okay? Because I know a lot of you struggled with number 43, or at least I had quite a few questions on it. So we're going to change this problem to be number 43. So it's 55n squared minus 52n plus 12. Okay? Well, the method we learned on Monday, what we did was we took that A term, which in this case is 55, times the C term, which is 12. And for this problem, you end up with 660, which is a really big number to think of what the factors are that add up to be, should be a 52, a negative 52. Okay, so they'd have to add to be negative 52. Okay? That's a really big number to work with. So this method makes it a little bit easier. Okay? So in this method, our A term goes in the first box, and our C term goes in the bottom right box. Okay? Now if we notice, this middle term is a negative 52, so these two boxes, this one's right here, have to add up to be a negative 52. Okay? And so what that means from us, since that C is positive, is that they both have to be negative. Okay? So what I'm going to think about are something that is divisible by the same number as 55 and something that is divisible by one of the numbers in 12. Okay? So 55 is a pretty unique number. The only things that go into it are 5 and 11. Okay? So if I think about that, and some numbers that I can use to get to 52, well, if we think about 5, we could use 15, we could use 10, we could use a 20, but if we think about 11, we could use 11 or 22, okay, because remember we're adding for these two. So if I put a 22n here, and remember it would have to be negative, right, because we're adding to get to a negative, so they have to be negative, right, and then I would need a negative 30 here. And this is guessing and checking. Some of you guys won't know that right away, but these are a lot smaller numbers to add to get 52 than having to think about what numbers multiply to get 660. Okay? But it really is just guessing and checking to figure out those numbers. So now what I look at, okay, because if I add negative 30 and a negative 22, I end up with negative 52. Okay, and so now what I look at is I look at my top row. Okay? And I check what I can factor out. Well, I know both 55 and 22 are divisible by 11, and they both have an n in them. Okay? I look at my bottom row, okay? And these are both divisible by 6. Okay? So I'm going to take out a 6. But if this one's negative, remember I said both my terms had to be negative, so I'm actually factoring out a negative 6. Okay? And now what I look for are these vertical columns. Okay? What number now, okay, times 11 gives me 55n is a 5n. 5 times 11 is 55, n times n is n squared. And then if I check the bottom, 5 times negative 6 gives me that negative 30n. Okay? So we do the same thing with the second columns. Okay? If I factor out 11 from negative 22, I end up with a negative 2. So negative 2 times 11n is negative 22n. And so now if I check, negative 2 times negative 6 gives me that positive 12. Okay, so what this ends up being are my factors are 5n minus 2 times 11n minus 6. Okay, so now I didn't have to think about that big number of 660. I am also going to do number 45 from your homework on the first part of 8.6. Number 45 was 63g squared minus 89g plus 30. Okay, so if I start with my box, I split it into those 4 squares. Okay. The first number, that a term, goes in the first box, 63g squared, and that c term goes in the last box, so 30. Okay. And again, I need to check my middle 2 rows, need to add up to negative 89. Okay, and what that tells me, since that c term is positive, but the middle term is negative, that both of these need to be negative. Okay, so now I'm going to again think about what numbers give me a sum of 89, and this is just guessing and checking. Okay, but I do know that it has to be something that's divisible by 63, by a number that 63 is divisible by, so it's by 7 or 9. And I need to know it has to be something that the other one needs to be something that 30 goes, or something that goes into 30 also goes into. So it could be 2, it could be 15, it could be 3, it could be 6, could be 5. Okay? So it's a guessing and checking problem. Okay? So 63, we know it's divisible by 7 and 9. So some other numbers that are divisible by 7, okay, or 9, one of them is 35. So I'm going to put 35g up here. And if I have 35 to get to 89, I need another 54 g's. Okay? So now when I look at these rows, I look this way. Okay? 63 and 35, we both just said were divisible by 7. Factor out the g from each. Okay? We look at the bottom row. Okay? If I look at that one, these are both divisible by 6. We're going to factor out that negative 6. Like I said, they both have to be negative. Okay. If I look at my columns, okay, the only other thing that 7 times 9, g, gives me that 63. So 9 times negative 6 gives me the negative 54, so that one works out. And 7 times a negative 5 gives me a negative 35g. So if I check the bottom box, negative 6 times negative 5 gives me that positive 30. So for this problem, your factors are 9g minus 5 and 7g minus 6. So the next problem in your notes. Okay? So we're going to look at one that's a little bit easier to see if this will help you understand this a little bit more. It's 6x squared plus 13x plus 5. So this one is already in your notes. Okay? So what I do, again, is I start that box. Okay? Step 1, which I guess I didn't do on those other two, but it's again to look at our terms and see if anything goes into them. But we know 13 is prime, so nothing's going to factor out. So I'm going to start by putting that a term in my first box, 6x squared, and that c term in my last box. Okay? And remember, these two have to add up to be our b term, which is 13. Okay? So now I need to think about what numbers go into 6. Right? I know 2 and 3 go into 6. Right? So let's think about other numbers that are divisible by either 2 or 3. Okay? And that have something that add up to be 13. Okay? So some numbers that add up to be 13 that are divisible by 2 or 3, we could have 6 and 6 plus 7. But I have 6x here in this first box. Okay? Then I'd have to have a 7 down here and nothing would factor. So 6 and 7 aren't going to work. So some other numbers that are divisible by 2 or 3, we could have 2 and 3. Right? So if I think about 3, okay, if I have 3x here, again in this first box, okay, that would mean I'd have to have 10x in this bottom box. Okay? Which if I have 3x here and 10x down here, both of these rows, this one's divisible by something, and this one's divisible by something. So those are the numbers I want to try to start with. Right? So 6x squared and 3x are both divisible by 3x. Okay? And 10x and 5 are both divisible by 5. Okay? So that's our first step. And then I'm going to figure out that top row. Well, if I have 3x, I need a 2x to get to 6x squared. And if I have 2x times 5, okay, these two here, okay, I get the 10x in this bottom box. Right? So if I factor out 3x from 3x, I'm left with a 1. So if I check these two, 5 times 1, I get this bottom box of 5. So for this one, my factors are 2x plus 1 and 3x plus 5. And that's our factors form. The next one in your notes is 10x squared plus 31x minus 14. So if I look at this one, again, I'm going to start by looking at my box. And actually I'm going to start by looking at my numbers, see if anything factors out. But I again know that 31 is not a very nice number and that nothing goes into it nicely. Okay, so I'm going to start by putting my a term in this first box, so 10x squared, and my c term in this bottom box, which notice this time I have a negative c, so that tells me my factors need one that's positive and one that's negative. Right? But they still have to add up to be a positive 31. Okay, so I really need to think about some numbers that are bigger than 31 that I can take something away from, right, and get 31. Okay? So something that goes into 10, okay, would be 2 and 5. So some numbers that are bigger than 31, that is like 2 or 5, okay, would be 32. Okay, but then I'd only subtract 1, right, and that wouldn't get me 14, right? Wouldn't be divisible by 14, okay? If I try 34, then I get rid of 3, which also has nothing else that goes into 14. If I go 35, then I would have to get rid of 4, and 4 and 14 are both divisible by 2, so let's try that one. So in this top box, I'm going to put 35x, and in this bottom box, I'm going to put a negative 4x, right? So looking at my top row, 10x squared and 35x, I'm going to factor out a 5x. In my bottom row, a negative 4x and a negative 14, I'm going to factor out a negative 2. Okay? So what that gets me, if I have 5x and I need to get to 10x, I have to take it times 2x. Right? Because 2 times 5 is 10, x times x gives me that x squared. Okay? And then I need to check again these bottom ones. Okay, so this negative 2 times 2x, if I multiply those together, I get the negative 4x in this bottom box. Okay? The second column, what do I need to take times 5x to get 35x? Is going to be a 7. Right? And if I take 7 times negative 2, I get negative 14. So my factors for this one are 5x minus 2, okay, this first side, and the 2x plus 7. The next one in your notes is 2x squared minus 11x plus 5. And again, start with my box. And some of these guys you might realize are easier to do that grouping method, and that's perfectly fine. I don't care which method you pick. In your notes we're doing them this box method, but if the other method makes more sense to you, feel free to do it that way. So that 2x squared goes here, and their 5 goes here. Okay, again, I should have first checked, does anything go into 2, 11, and 5? 11's prime, so I know nothing's going to go into there. Okay, and then I need to remember that these two here have to add up to be a negative 11. Okay, so what that negative 11 means, since my C term is positive, is that both of my factors need to be negative. So when I solve this one, I should know that my first term up here in this top right box has to be divisible by 2, because this number has to be divisible by 2, my first box. Okay, so the numbers that are under 11 that are divisible by 2 would either be 2x, okay, 4x, 8x, 10x. Okay? But that's what we're going to need to do, is pick one that also is divisible by 5, since my bottom term right here is 5. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a 10x. Okay? So if I put a 10x there, then I need a 1x here. Remember, these are both negative because they have to add up to be negative 11. Okay? So in this first row, what I'm going to factor out is going to be a 2x. Okay? In this bottom row, what I can factor out is really only a 1. And since the first term's negative, it has to be a negative 1. Okay? So when I look at my columns now, 2x times what gives me 2x squared? It's just going to be x. And if I check that bottom box, remember we always have to check that that matches here. I have x times a negative 1. X times negative 1 gives me a negative 1x in this box, so that checks. And if I have 2x, I'm going to need a negative 5 to get to negative 10x. Okay? And if I again check that bottom box, so now I'm taking this negative 5 times this negative 1, and that gives me the positive 5 in this box. So my factors are 2x minus 1 times the quantity of x minus 5. Okay, 2 left. So let's look at this bottom one, or the next one in your notes. Starts with a negative 5n squared minus 2n plus 3. Okay, so the first thing you should always check if something factors, and if you notice this first term is negative, so we should know we have to factor out something. Okay, remember, whenever that a term is negative, you have to factor out. And the only thing that goes into all those numbers is a negative 1. So I'm going to take out a negative 1, which is going to leave me with 5n squared plus 2n minus 3. Okay? So in this box method, start with my box. I'm going to put my a term in the first box, 5n squared, and my c term in the bottom corner. Okay? So now I need to think about my middle two squares, which again need to add up to be a positive 2n. Right? So if I have a negative c term, remember one of my factors has to be positive and one has to be negative. So some numbers that are only 2 apart, right, that have something divisible by 5 and something divisible by 3 are actually going to be 5n and a negative 3n. Okay? Because if I combine these, 5n minus 3n is a positive 2n. And if I look at this top row,
can I please have Josh Storsved, Michael Storsved? Can I have Thompson and Nathan Landry come to the office, please? Thank you.
If I look at that top row, I can factor out a 5n. And if I look at the bottom row, I can factor out a negative 3. Okay? So when I do that, 5n times what gives me 5n squared is going to be n. If I check this bottom corner, this n times negative 3 is negative 3n, so that part works. 5n times 1 gives me 5n, and negative 3 times 1 gives me negative 3. Okay, so this time my final answer, okay, actually involves 3 factors because we started by factoring out a -1. So we have to remember to bring this term down because we already factored that out. And so what I'm left with now is n plus 1 on the top times 5n minus 3 on that side. So I think you have one more in your notes, and that one's a word problem. Which I don't know what happened to mine printed, but we'll just go through it. It says there is a rectangle that is 8x squared plus 22x
please come to the office. Coach Rich.
plus 15. Right? They want us to figure out what are some possible dimensions of that rectangle. So again, if you want to use that grouping method, it's perfectly fine, you can. But you remember, if you take 8 times 15, you're going to end up needing to think about factors of 120, okay? Which gets a little bit more complicated than just thinking about numbers that add up to 22, okay? So if I look at those numbers, okay, nothing factors out, right? 8's only divisible by 2, 4, and 8, but 15 isn't divisible by any of those, so that's not going to help us. So I'm going to start by making my box. A term goes first, 8x squared, and C term goes last. All of them are positive, so everything's going to be positive, and I need to have these two add up to be 22x. Okay? So some numbers that go into 22, pretty easy numbers to think about, would be 10 and 12, which actually work perfectly because I know 12 is divisible by 4, just like 8, and I know 10 is divisible by 5, just like 15. So we're going to put a 12x here, because these are both going to be divisible by that 4, and a 10x here, because these are both going to be divisible by 5. Okay, so these two are going to be divisible by 4. So I'm going to factor out a 4x, and these two are both going to be divisible by 5. So I'm going to factor out a 5. Okay, what that leaves me with, how do I get 8x squared from 4x, is by taking it times 2x. And if I check the bottom, 2x times 5 gives me 10x, so that one checks. If I check this top side, 4x times what gives me 12x is going to be 3. So if I check this bottom x, 3 times 5 gives me 15, so it checks. So my possible dimensions are 4x plus 5 times the quantity of 2x plus 3.
Coach Richardson, can you please come to the office? Coach Richardson.
And remember, since we're talking about a length, it's labeled in units.